Today we're going to be looking at game theory. Game theory is, I guess you could call it a relatively new tool for microeconomics, although it's been around for a while. Its applications continue to be seen and to continue to grow. What microeconomists are doing when we look at game theory is we're trying to get outside the normal bounds of our traditional models. There's a lot of restrictions, of course, a lot of assumptions on the models that we've been using. Game theory allows us a fair amount of flexibility in trying to understand behavior of people, especially in somewhat unusual circumstances. The advantage to game theory is that it allows us to incorporate a lot of features that would normally happen in regular interactions among people. We can have retaliation to decisions that have been made. We can have strategies that are adopted. We have a lot of interactions, and the outcomes of games really depend upon the interactions of the players involved. Now, game theory itself can be pretty complicated. It can be incredibly mathematical, and there are full semesters worth of courses that you can take at the undergraduate and graduate levels in economics that are that involve these really in-depth aspects of game theory. What I'm going to do here is just to introduce you to the basics, what you have to be able to use game theory as an analysis, and we'll take a look at some basic games as well. But I think even with this relatively rudimentary introduction into game theory, you're going to be able to see some important applications for this tool, and hopefully you will get value out of what we're learning here. When we look at game theory, probably the best question to start with is why. Why do people do things that they do? Why do people engage in sometimes destructive behavior in some cases? Why do they adopt the strategies that they adopt? For instance, Bill Belichick's a great coach. Why does his team always cheat? Well, we can answer that question to an extent with game theory. Game theory is one of these tools that helps us to get a better feel for why people do what they do. So let's take a look at some basics of game theory first. When we look at games and game theory, one of the things that is incredibly valuable about game theory is that it provides us with a lot of flexibility. Again, as I mentioned in the introduction, it takes us outside of our constraints, outside of the limiting assumptions that most of our models have. And it allows us to incorporate different kinds of behaviors. Additionally, there are some downsides. One of the downsides is that game theory is pretty narrow in scope. And what I mean by that is there's no single game theoretic approach that allows us to say this enormous group of behaviors can be explained through this specific game. So in game theory, there's a lot of it depends upon how we set the game up. A lot of it depends upon, it depends upon the situation and the setting that the game is placed in. Additionally, that means that the game theoretic approach can get really complex, and that's a little bit of a downside. Well, actually, it's kind of a big downside. But the most important thing to understand about game theory is not that there are limitations and not that it allows us more flexibility, but that the outcome of any of these games is entirely interdependent upon the actions taken by the players. So no single player can say, this is what the game will always be. Players can always make choices that lead to different outcomes. You have to be careful of the choice you make, of course. There might be better alternatives for you as an individual in the game, but the interdependence still exists within the game, so we need to be aware of that. Any game is going to have specific parts. It's like when you take a new game out of a box, a board game, not not a game that you've downloaded for your phone or anything like that. But when you take a game out of a box, there are instructions, and it tells you how to play the game, and it tells you what should be involved in the game. Any game is going to have parts to it. First of all, of course, we need players. Now, any game can be expanded, but we're going to look primarily at games where you have 2 players. It just makes the analysis a whole lot easier. Whenever you start introducing more players, the number of strategies and the payoffs that come from those strategies start to explode. So we just want to look at 2 players to start with. Additionally, we want to look at the strategies. The strategies are the courses of action that the players adopt. So do I do this, do I make this move, or do I make that move? That's what we mean by the strategies. And finally, we have the payoffs. So the payoffs are the rewards for playing the game. Now the payoffs, this is where that interaction comes in. The payoffs will be different depending upon what strategy you adopt and the strategy that your opponent adopts. So that leads us to a particular payoff. And I'll show you what this looks like in just a minute. So furthermore, when we're building a game, when we're looking at a game, there are certain considerations that we have to take into account. One is, when is it your turn? So this would be in the instructions of the game. How do we play the game? And sometimes games are simultaneous, which means you have to make a choice at exactly the same time as your opponent. Think about the game rock, paper, scissors. So we go rock, paper, scissors, shoot. If the game is not simultaneous, in other words, if both players aren't doing their rock, paper, scissors, shoot at the same time, then even with a split-second difference, I can tell what you're going to throw, and then I can throw the thing that beats you. And if the opponent thinks that I'm trying to cheat, then we start to get angry at each other, and the game kind of falls apart. With a simultaneous game, you have to go at exactly the same time. A sequential game is a game that is dependent upon one player going and one player reacting to what they've seen. And maybe the first player gets to react to the second player, and the second player gets a second chance to react. Sequential games are ordered games. And whether we're playing a simultaneous game or a sequential game, that's going to dictate how, I guess how the board of the game is set up. What that means is we can set up our games in what's in a matrix form or a game theory tree form. I'll talk more about that in just a second. Another consideration we have to account for is whether or not you play well with others. By that, I mean, are you going to cooperate with the team, with the opponent, or are you going to try to beat the opponent? If you cooperate, then what you're doing is you're trying to maximize the joint benefit, maximize the benefit for all of the players. If it's a non-cooperative game, then you're trying to maximize your own benefit, and it doesn't really matter what happens to the other person. They might make out pretty well. They might be harmed by your decision. That's inconsequential. What's important is what happens to you. Then finally, we want to know when the game ends. This game could go on forever, or it could just be a one-time deal. Some games are one-shot games, and other games are repeated. And whether you're dealing with a one-shot game or a repeated game, that can very much affect the strategy that you adopt. So we need to know these considerations about our games. So do we use a matrix or a game tree? Well, let's take a look. A matrix is what we call the strategic form of the game. It's a simple way to see the payoffs, the players, the strategies, and kind of a snapshot. Because of that, the matrices that we look at, the game theory matrix, is applied to games that are one shot. So usually almost always, these are games that you have one chance at. Once the game is over, you don't get to play again. They are simultaneous, so the players have to make a choice at the same time without knowing what the other player is going to do. But they can be cooperative or not cooperative games. A game tree, on the other hand, is what we call the extensive form of the game. And when I show you a tree, you'll see what I mean by extensive form, because it can get pretty extensive pretty quickly. We use these if the moves are sequential. We can see that here's where the game starts, and then we can follow the branches of the tree to see where the game ends up. So when we use a game tree, we're using usually a repeated game, so the game is played over and over. It's sequential, so one player makes a choice, another player responds to that choice. And these can also be cooperative or not cooperative games. So that's some of the basics of game theory. And you'll start to see as we build matrices and a game tree, how all of this stuff fits together. But before we do that, we need to think about how we're going to figure out our strategy. How do we figure out what it is that we're going to do in the game to win? Now, I do want to make a point here about winning. Winning doesn't mean all the time that you have more than your opponent at the end of a game. Sometimes it means you have the same amount. Sometimes it means you have more, and sometimes it means you have less, just depending upon what your strategies are. When I say win the game, what I mean by that is just to achieve your objective, and oftentimes that is just to have as much as you can get. Whether you have less than the other person doesn't matter as long as you have the most for yourself. So figuring out a strategy is trying to figure out how to do the best you can for yourself, regardless of what happens to the other person. When we look at strategies, the easiest strategy to adopt, the easiest strategy to visualize is something we call the dominant strategy. A dominant strategy is a strategy you will adopt no matter what the other person does because it leads to the highest payoff for you. So let's see what it means to adopt a dominant strategy in the context of a game theoretic tree and a game theoretic matrix.
So here's a game theory matrix. We just have a box and different payoffs that go into the box. So we'll put just two businesses here. We'll just call them firm 1 and firm 2. And the firms need to have different strategies. So we'll say that they'll go with a low output or a high output. Those are the two strategies. And each firm has a strategy. Now, usually what we do is we put the first firms or the first player's payoffs, the one on the left-hand side of the box, we put their payoffs first. So I'm just going to draw in the payoffs for these firms first, or this firm first, and then I will draw in firm 2's payoffs. I'll do these in colors just to make it a little bit clearer. So here are the payoffs for firm 2. Now the question is, what's the equilibrium in this game? Well, to figure out the equilibrium, we need to figure out what the dominant strategy of the players is. So what we do is we try to figure out what would a player do no matter what their opponent does. So to do that, let's kind of ignore this part right here. Let's just ignore this and say that firm 1 is going to produce a low output no matter what. If they do that, firm 2 looks at the options and they say, well, I could either produce low, which would give me 20, or I could produce high, which would give me 30. I would prefer 30 to 20, so I will choose the option of producing a high output. 30 is a better payoff for me. Now, if we instead said, let's ignore this part up here, and firm 1 is going to produce high output, what's the best thing for firm 2 to do? Well, they could produce low and go with 17, or they could produce high and go with 25. Well, clearly 25 is better than 17, so firm 2 would produce a high output. That means that no matter what firm 1 does, firm 2 will produce a high output which means they have a dominant strategy. No matter what the other firm does, this is what I will do. Now let's see about firm 1. Let's go back here and say that firm 1 is trying to figure out what they should do. If firm 2 is going to produce a low output, in other words, we're going to get rid of all of this over here. If firm 2 produces a low output, firm 1 could produce low and have 10, or they could produce high and have 20. Clearly, the 20 is preferred. If firm 2 produces a high output, then firm 1 could produce low and have 9, or high and have 18. Well, 18 is better. So we see that no matter what firm 2 does, it is in firm 1's interest to produce high. They have a dominant strategy. And firm 2 has a dominant strategy to produce high. So the outcome of this game will be right here, where both firms produce a high output. That's because both firms have a dominant strategy. So let's take a look at our dominant strategy game theory matrix in the form of a game theory tree. When we set up a tree, what we're doing is we're setting up a sequential game. So here we have player A, or firm 1. And whenever we see a number or a player in a circle, that means a decision has to be made. Player 1 has to decide, or firm 1 has to decide, will I produce low output or high output? And then before we can see what the end of the game looks like, player 2 has to make a choice. So here, in this position in the tree, a choice has to be made. And the choice is, should I produce high output or low output? And then on the end, at the end of the tree, we put the payoffs. So the payoffs were these. So I'm just going to have firm 1 here in red and firm 2 in blue. This is the extensive form of the game because we see that these payoffs get extended out, and we see that there are branches to the tree. Of course, we could continue on. We don't have to just have 2 decisions, one for the player 1, one for player 2. This is a sequential game, but it could go on and on and on. So we could have a situation where, for example, let's just erase this, where at the end of the node of the tree, we have yet another decision that needs to be made. Now, of course, that would expand the tree and make it even more extensive and expansive. But this is what a game theory tree looks like. It's useful, once again, for sequential games because we are able to see what the sequence of events looks like and what all of the potential outcomes of the game could be. And we will get the same result as we would in a matrix. But what we're going to look at here is player 2 makes the last decision based on our little game theory tree that we have here. Player 2 wants the best possible outcome for themselves. So they see that by pricing high, I either get 30 or 25. That's better than either of the options 20 or 17. So we know that player 2 is going to choose the high output. Player 1 looks back and says, well, if they're going to choose the higher output, What are my options? My options are to either get 9 or 18, and I would prefer 18.
So what happens if you don't have a dominant strategy? That's a very real possibility. In fact, in the world, you're more often than not going to have a situation without a dominant strategy. How do we solve the game then? Well, without the dominant strategies, things get a little bit more complicated. But we can still solve the games. One of the ways we solve a game is through the process of using a Nash equilibrium. The Nash equilibrium is named after this guy, John Nash, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1994. He was a mathematician by training, and maybe you've seen the movie A Beautiful Mind. It's about, well, it's a movie loosely based on the life of John Nash. He worked at solving game theory and came up with this solution, this relatively elegant solution to help us explain and understand why we reached a certain outcome in a game. Of course, as we've understood so far, the outcome of games is dependent upon what other players do. But if there isn't a dominant strategy, which is again more like real life, we need to figure out a way to get to that solution. The Nash equilibrium is an equilibrium without a dominant strategy. So it is a non-dominant strategy outcome where the choice you make is the best one for you given what the other player chooses. So in this case, it could be a situation where the other player has a dominant strategy, but you don't. So you make the best choice possible given that they're going to follow their dominant strategy. Another way of looking at this would be to say that a Nash equilibrium exists when there's no way for a player to unilaterally change their strategy and improve their position. So if I make a choice and I change my mind and it makes me worse off, then that's not good for me. And if you look at the outcome and you say, I'm going to change my mind and it makes it worse off for you, then we're probably in a Nash equilibrium. The dominant strategy equilibrium is actually a special case of Nash equilibrium, where once you get to that dominant strategy outcome, neither player can make themselves better off by changing their minds. If they change their minds, they will be worse off. Their opponent might be better off, but that's not the point. The point is that you would be worse off. This is also related to the Cournot model that we've looked at when we looked at oligopoly. Sometimes it's called a Cournot-Nash equilibrium because once you get to that point, that Cournot equilibrium, if you change your output decision, you're going to make yourself worse off. You're going to move to a different isoprofit curve. So we've actually already seen a Nash equilibrium in here. The Cournot equilibrium is a form of Nash. So let's take a look at a game theory matrix where we have a Nash equilibrium that doesn't involve strictly dominant strategies. We're going to look at the Nash equilibrium without two dominant strategies by looking at pigs.
So here's the situation. We have two pigs put into a fenced-in enclosure. We have the weak pig and we have a strong pig. And what happens, in order to get fed, there's a lever at this end of the enclosure that has to be pushed. Meanwhile, the food comes out of a chute over here. So here's the food, yummy food over here. So the pushing happens here, but the food is distributed over here. So the pigs have to run, and here's a pig. The pig has to run to get the food. Now, if the strong pig and the weak pig are both over here pushing the lever, there's the lever, the strong pig can outrun the weak pig and get all the food. So there's the dilemma. So let's put the payoffs into a matrix. We'll put the put the strong pig over here, put the weak pig up here. And so the strategies are either to push or to wait. So in other words, one pig is up here pushing, the other pig could be over here waiting for the other pig to do the work. So let's put the strong pig's payoffs in red, the weak pig's payoffs, we'll do the strong pig in blue, the weak pig in red. And let's say they both push. If they both push, that means they're up here on this end. They exert effort to run and get the food, but the strong pig gets to the food first, knocks the weak pig out of the way, and the weak pig doesn't eat. That means that the weak pig gets a payoff of -10. If the strong pig pushes and the weak pig waits, though, the weak pig doesn't have to run. They can eat some of the food before the strong pig gets there, and so the weak pig will get a payoff of 15. If both pigs wait, then the weak pig gets nothing because there is nobody pushing the lever to distribute the food. And if the weak pig pushes while the strong pig waits, well, the weak pig pushes the lever, runs over, and by the time he gets there, the food is all gone because the strong pig has eaten it. So those are the payoffs for the weak pig. If the strong pig pushes, the strong pig gets 90. If the strong pig pushes while the weak pig is waiting, the weak pig gets some of the food, the strong pig gets some of the food. He gets a payoff of 75. Of course, if both of the pigs are doing waiting, then neither pig gets anything. And if the strong pig is waiting while the weak pig is pushing, then the strong pig doesn't have to exert any effort. He just eats all the food and gets a payoff of 100. Okay, so what's going to happen here? What's the dominant strategy for these two pigs? Let's take a look at the strong pig first. Does the strong pig have a dominant strategy? Let's see. If the weak pig pushes, then the strong pig should wait. He would get 100 over 90. But if the weak pig waits, then the strong pig, if he waits, he gets 0. In order to get any kind of positive payoff, he has to push. So in this case, the strong pig's payout, depends on what the weak pig does. So there is no dominant strategy. In this game, we've got no dominant strategy for the strong pig. But what about the weak pig? If we look at what the weak pig does, what's in the weak pig's best interest? Well, if the strong pig pushes, then it is in the weak pig's interest to wait. 15 is bigger than -10. And if the strong pig waits, then it is also in the weak pig's interest to wait because 0 is bigger than -10. So in this case, what we see is a game where the weak pig has a dominant strategy to wait, while the strong pig has no dominant strategy. So given this situation, it makes sense for the strong pig to push, the weak pig to follow its dominant strategy. And if the strong pig figures this out, it is the dominant strategy of the weak pig to do this. What's in the strong pig's best interest? Well, it's to push because they're either going to get 0 or 75. So here what we have is a Nash equilibrium without two dominant strategies. Why is it a Nash equilibrium? Well, look, if the weak pig changes his strategy, can he improve himself? Well, to do that, he would have to push, moving him over here to a -10. Well, that's no good. Can the strong pig improve himself by changing his mind? In other words, I'm going to wait. Well, that would put everybody down here. That's no good for the strong pig. So this is a Nash equilibrium because you cannot unilaterally change your mind and make yourself better off. If you are in this box, the strong pig could say, I'm going to push. That would improve himself. So this is not a Nash equilibrium. If you're in this box, the weak pig could say, well, I'm pushing now, I will move over here. That makes me better off. So this box is not a Nash equilibrium. And if we're up here in the push-push, the weak pig can say, I'm not pushing anymore, I'm going to wait, I'll move over here. So this box is not a Nash equilibrium either. So we have a Nash equilibrium because one player has a dominant strategy and it makes sense for the second player to do the best thing for them given that dominant strategy.
Probably the most famous of all games is something we call the prisoner's dilemma. You may have even seen this in a movie or a TV show. That the idea behind the prisoner's dilemma is pretty simple. You have two people who are picked up on charges of a relatively petty crime, and they are brought into a police office into the precinct, and they're put in separate rooms. A detective walks into one room and says to the first perpetrator, and they say, you know what, we've got you red-handed on this petty crime, but we're pretty sure you've been involved in something more nefarious, a bigger crime ring. We'd like you to help us out here. We'd like you to provide some evidence for us in order to help break up this crime ring. And if you do that, we'll cut you a really nice deal. Now, your partner next door, they're looking a little squeamish over there. We've brought this up to them, and right now they've been keeping their mouths shut, but I'm not sure that's going to last. I need you to help me out first, and I'll make sure you have a good deal. But if you don't, and they tell on you, they rat you out, you're going to the jail for a long, long time. So why don't you think about that? And the detective gets up, walks out of the room, walks down the hall to the other room, where the other perpetrator is sitting there, looking rather smug. The detective walks in, sits down, says, look, we've got you dead to rights on this petty crime, but we're pretty sure you're involved in a more nefarious operation here. We would like you to help us out. Provide some evidence so we can break up this crime ring. And if you do that, I'll make it worth your while. You'll have to serve some time for this petty crime, but we'll give you a really good deal. Now, I've talked to your friend next door. They're looking a little squeamish over there. They're not sure what they're going to do. I need you to rat them out first. And if you do, I'll make sure that your partner goes to jail for a long, long time. You'll be able to get out of the state, maybe even out of the country, start a new life, because I'll give you a really great deal. But I need you to cooperate with me. So why don't you think about that? Then the detective gets up, walks out of the room, goes and stands in the hall where he's looking through the one-way mirrors and looking at the two perps and wondering what they're going to do. The prisoners are in a dilemma because if they both keep their mouths shut, their crime will not lead to much of a jail sentence. But if they both talk, they'll get a lot more time. So what is the prisoner's dilemma? Well, the prisoner's dilemma is that we've got this game theoretic model that illustrates how difficult it is to achieve cooperation, to get people to work together. because the joint payoff for the two criminals will be larger. In other words, they'll have less jail time if they work together. But because the way the payoffs are set up, each player pursues a strategy that leaves them worse off than they could be if they would cooperate. That's the dilemma. And that's a big problem for prisoners. And it's a big problem for a lot of other choices that we make. This prisoner's dilemma structure of a game helps to explain a lot of interesting behavior. So we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. When we look at a prisoner's dilemma, we're looking at a simultaneous game. So the players don't have a chance to react. There's no sequence here. They have to make a choice right now. They can't wait to see what the other player does. And it's non-cooperative. You're trying to do the best you can for yourself, while the other player's trying to do the best they can for themselves. And this is a one-shot game. You only have one chance to make this work. So let's take a look at the game theory matrix and see if we can understand the process that leads us to the outcome, and then we'll talk about some of the various ways the prisoner's dilemma can be seen in the real world. So here we have a game theory matrix. We have two players. We have Walter over here, and we have Jesse up here. So Jesse's payoffs will be in red and Walter's will be in blue. And they have two things that they can choose between. They can either confess or they can keep quiet. So these are two people in jail. And you notice what the payoffs are. If they both confess, they both get 8 years. And if they both keep quiet, they only get 2. If those were the only two options, it would be obvious that they would both keep quiet. But these two possibilities, these two things we call the off diagonals, that's where the interesting part comes in. Because Walter could end up with 1 year by confessing, while Jesse goes to jail for 15. And Jesse could end up with 1 year by confessing. If Walter keeps quiet, Walter goes to jail for 15 years. So how do we get to the equilibrium in this equation, or in this matrix? Let's take a look at the dominant strategy possibilities here. So let's say that Walter pledges to confess. He makes a blood pact with Jesse and says, if we ever get arrested, I will confess. I'll tell everything. If that's the case, what's Jesse's dominant strategy? In other words, what is better for Jesse? Well, if we look at the red numbers, we can see that Jesse would get 8 years for confessing or 15 years for keeping quiet. Presuming Jesse doesn't want to go to jail for any longer than he has to, his best choice, if Walter confesses, is to confess. Now, if Walter, on the other hand, says, Jesse, if we get arrested, you can trust me. I will never, ever confess to anything. Well, if that's the case, Jesse has two options here. He could go to jail for 1 year, or he could go to jail for 2 years. If Jesse confesses while Walter keeps quiet, he gets that 1 year sentence. If he keeps quiet, he gets the 2 year sentence. Well, 1 is better than 2, so Jesse takes the 1 year sentence by confessing. Which means that no matter what Walter does, Jesse has a dominant strategy to confess. Now let's see what Walter's payoffs look like. If Jesse says, Walter, you can trust me, I'm going to keep quiet, Walter says, look, 1 year is better than 2. If you keep quiet, I'm going to confess. And if Jesse says, I'm going to confess no matter what, Walter looks at that and says, well, 8 years is better than 15. I'll take the 8 by confessing. That means that Walter's dominant strategy is also to confess. So if both of these criminals, these prisoners, follow their dominant strategy, it puts us in the confess box, which isn't the best box. Down here is the best joint box because they both get 2 years and a combined 4 in jail. But up here they get a combined 16 years in jail. That's no good. But that's the dominant strategies of both players, and so that's where you end up, in the confess box, and that's the dilemma. Now, before we talk about how to get out of the dilemma, let's talk about ways and places we see this prisoner's dilemma in the world. It's not just for prisoners. So where do we see the prisoner's dilemma in the real world? We see it a lot of different places. We see it in sports. I started off by asking the question, why? Why does Belichick cheat? Why do the Astros cheat? Why do teams in NASCAR, what do they say? If you're not cheating, you're not trying. It's because if I don't cheat, other people probably are, and that puts me at a disadvantage. So we all cheat. Why do athletes take steroids? Why do cyclists and track athletes continue to get busted for performance-enhancing drugs? It's because of a prisoner's dilemma. They think that if I don't cheat and everybody else cheats, I'm in a worse position. We see this in advertising. Advertising's kind of stupid in some industries. Think about Coke and Pepsi. Pretty much everybody knows what Coke tastes like and what Pepsi tastes like, and they have their preferences. Yet we see Coke and Pepsi spend millions and millions and millions of dollars every year on advertising. Why do they do that? Well, the answer is it's a prisoner's dilemma. If you don't spend the money and your opponent does, you could lose lots of sales. We see this in war. Why do countries go to war sometimes? Because they've set the game up where war is the dominant strategy. We see this in politics. Politicians say, oh, I won't talk bad about my opponent. And they always talk bad about their opponents. Those negative ads that are put out. It's not my fault. It's one of the people who are supporting me. They're putting out the negative advertising. It doesn't matter. We always kind of end up in the gutter somewhere. Why? Because negative advertising is actually pretty effective. And if you don't engage in it and your opponent does, you're likely to lose. It's a prisoner's dilemma. And we see it in the comics. Why do superheroes fight each other? It's not just Captain America and Iron Man. It's not just Batman and Superman. It happens all the time. And the reason might just be a prisoner's dilemma, where the payoffs are set up so that the dominant strategy of the heroes is to fight. We see the prisoner's dilemma in a lot of places. It's an interesting way of explaining behavior that at first glance seems pretty irrational. So how do you solve the prisoner's dilemma? Well, probably the most important thing is you need a credible commitment. You need something that says, look, if you go against the best outcome here and you go with your dominant strategy, something is going to happen. There needs to be a way to enforce the threat of harm to one of the participants. It helps if you can keep the number of players small. That way there's fewer people to narc, fewer people to rat the other ones out. Contracts are a possibility, but this is a little bit dicey if you're engaged in illegal activity. So if you're engaged in illegal activity, there's not going to be any contract that is enforced to say, hey, we are engaged in illegal activity, like cartel behavior, to keep output low. This person violated our contract. Would you enforce that? And would you enforce the illegal activity? That's probably not going to happen. But you can see what happens in the case of the Olympics or in the case of professional sports, where if somebody is caught violating the contract against performance-enhancing drugs, they get kicked out. A third-party enforcement mechanism can be very useful here as well. So going back to the idea of contracts, if you have some sort of extra legal organization that says, hey, if you violate the rule here that we have on performance enhancing drugs, then you will be banned by our organization. And we have these outside independent doctors and drug testing agencies who will enforce the contract and help us to prove whether you have violated it or not. Of course, you could just use violence, and this is what the mafia uses. When you have a crime cartel and people are getting arrested on a regular basis, then you need some enforcement mechanism, and that usually comes with the threat of violence or actual violence, not just to the person who commits, who turns state's evidence or who rats out their conspirators, but also to the families of their conspirators. So you can say, hey, look, if you rat out anybody, if you're ever arrested and you rat anybody out, we'll not only break your legs, but we'll break the legs of your children, of your grandmother, of your pets. We'll do terrible, terrible things to you. That's a way to solve the prisoner's dilemma, and it seems to have been pretty effective in the crime world. Well, that brings us to other types of games. We've been talking about one-shot games here, but what happens if you have a repeated game? What happens if you have a game that can be played more than one time? If you do, that means you can retaliate for any bad behavior. You can say, hey, if you do this, then I will respond to what you've done and make life worse for you. When we have repeated games, we have different kinds of strategies to consider. One is called a trigger strategy. A trigger strategy is a strategy that you adopt that says, what I do is going to depend on what the rival did in the previous version of the game or the previous iteration of the game. So if you did this, if you chose a strategy that made me worse off, then here's what I will do in response. You might have a strategy that says, all you have to do is screw up once, and I will not cooperate with you forever for the rest of time. That would be what we call a grim trigger strategy, where the outcome forever after is the less preferred outcome. Another kind of trigger strategy, though, is called a tit-for-tat strategy. And this is a strategy where you respond to your opponent by doing exactly what they did in the previous period. So if you have a game where all you have to decide is whether you're going to cooperate or not cooperate. And so in period 1, you both cooperate. In period 2, your opponent cheats because it gives them a bigger payoff while you cooperate. Then in period 3, you cheat because that's what they did the last time. So it would be something like this. In period 1, you both cooperate, so that's your strategy. You saw that the other player cooperated. It led to a nice payoff. So in period 2, you also cooperate. But your opponent cheats. So here you both cooperate. In period 2, your opponent cheats because that short-term gain exists for them cheating. But now we have a third period. So in period 3, you do what the other player did. So you cheat. If you both cheat, then the payoff is worse for both of you. If your opponent cooperates, then it's worse for them, but it's their fault for cheating in the first place. But if they cooperate while you cheat, you get a bigger payoff. Now, hopefully what this signals to the players in the game is that this going back and forth between cheating and cooperating doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Because you have the chance to respond, hopefully what happens is you both end up in the cooperate zone and you continue to cooperate, and over time this is the better payoff for you. But the tit-for-tat strategy simply says, whatever you did last time, opponent, that's what I'm going to do this time. And you can figure that out pretty quickly. Again, this is not as good as if everybody always cooperates, but it's certainly better than the grim trigger strategy that says don't cooperate ever again. Which brings us to one important question here. And this relates back to oligopolies. Does it make sense for firms to collude? Does it make sense for firms to choose the option in a game theoretic setup where they gang up on consumers all the time? And the answer is probably not. In a game's theoretic setting where collusion is possible, cheating tends to be the normal outcome. We saw this with the Chamberlain model. Collusions over time may seem like a better outcome because the payoffs are bigger if you cooperate in the collusion. But changing any aspect of the assumptions that we make leads to cheating. We make a lot of assumptions about collusion. We assume that there are two firms. We assume that there's no entry, that both firms have identical costs, that they're selling the same product, that they have complete knowledge of strategies, and that the game is infinitely repeated. So even though it may seem like collusion is the best outcome, that it will lead to the best payoffs, there's always the short-term enticement of cheating on the collusion. Let's take a real quick look at one last game matrix here that deals with collusion.
Okay, so let's take a look at this payoff matrix for two firms. And the firms are trying to decide whether it makes sense to collude or not. In other words, should we cheat or should we cooperate with each other? Those are the strategies. We have firm 1 over here. We have firm 2 up here. And so firm 1's payoffs look like this. Firm 2's payoffs look like this. Now clearly what we see here is that it is in both firms' best interests to be right here. This leads to the highest joint payoff. That would be the collusion payoff right here. But is this what's going to happen? Well, based upon the way this is set up, probably not, unless there's some way to enforce the collusion. Because we have dominant strategies at play. The dominant strategy of firm 1 if firm 2 cheats, it's to cheat. If firm 2 cooperates, it's to cheat. So firm 1's dominant strategy is cheating. Firm 2, if firm 1 cheats, firm 2 should also cheat. 10 is bigger than 5. If firm 1 cooperates, firm 2 should cheat because 25 is bigger than 20. So firm 2 has the incentive to cheat, which puts us in this box, which is clearly worse than it is if they cooperate, but that's the incentive. What do we have here? We have a prisoner's dilemma. The collusive outcome is the better outcome, but cheating is what almost always happens because of the dominant strategy.
This brings us to one final point, and that is sometimes games are one shot, sometimes games are repeated. But what happens if you have a game that's repeated and you know the firm end of the game? So there's a clear date in the future when the game will end. This could lead to the unraveling of a cooperative strategy as well through a process we call backward induction. If you know when the game is going to end, you can see that it's clearly in your interest to cheat at some point. The question is, when is it in your interest to cheat? The only reason you would cooperate is because there's a positive payoff for doing so in the future. So you're signaling your willingness to cooperate with someone. But it makes sense to cheat in the last period because there's no future after that. So, if I know you are going to cheat in the last period, then because of the prisoner's dilemma, it's in my interest to cheat as well in the last period. But if I want to receive any gain from cheating, then I should cheat in the next to last period. Because if you cooperate and I cheat, I get a bigger payoff, and then we both cheat at the end. But if you're smart, you will know that I am thinking that way. So you will also cheat in the next to last period, which means for me to gain any benefit from cheating, I need to cheat in the next to the last period. And of course, this can just back itself all the way out to the point where it just makes sense to cheat, period, end of sentence. So that's it for the basics of game theory. As you can see, there's lots going on in game theory. We've just barely scraped the surface of game theory here. But I would suggest if you have a chance in the future, take a full course in game theory. It's really worth your time. There's a lot of really solid applications and a lot of ways that we can see what happens and explain the behaviors of seemingly unusual activities that in the context of game theory actually make a whole lot of sense.